This is it. We should only do reunion shows.
I love it.
I love it too.
Everything is happening.
You guys. Well, I'm here again with the wonderful and kind Justin and Dawn. And it's been 4 years since our episode aired, which is so
Wow.
strange because how does time work? But I wanted a chance to check in with you both and hear about your work, what you're working on now. The last time we talked on this podcast, we explored the origins of the Widowed Parent Project. And Dawn, I wondered if you'd start. I'd love to hear how the work has grown since we talked.
I'm happy to say that the work with the widowed parents, not just widowed fathers, has continued. And even since then, we've extended beyond widowed parents to parenting with cancer.
Mm-hmm.
So our main work these days, in addition to continuing the widowed parent group, is to focus on people who have cancer and they also have dependent children at home and how we can serve them better. So the work has continued and grown, and it's all been informed by what we've learned from initially these parents who have the lived experience of having a co-parent die from cancer, but it's informed how we take care of parents who have cancer.
What do you think that centralizing insight was that that made the foundation of this new kind of expanded thought?
Justin may have another idea, but for me, it was quite frankly listening to dozens of parents who witnessed their loved one living with and then dying from cancer and reflecting on the things that we got right as a medical field, the things that we got wrong, and the room for improvement. And so that was we heard so many stories, things like, if I had known then what I know now, or if I could go back in time, I might do this different. It was an imperative for us to try to improve cancer care for parents based on what we learned from these widows.
Yeah. Justin, what do you think you know now that they need that you didn't know before?
I think what parents with cancer need, first of all, is for their providers to be honest with them, to be straight with them about their situation, about their choices, and to be able to help parents not feel like they have to choose between either trying to live and survive and fight this cancer or make plans in case it doesn't go as well. I think both those two things, they seem like they would be in opposition, but they can actually live in concert. And I think that's a really hard balancing act for parents to find. And I think that's where it's incumbent upon folks like us to work with these families to help them and kind of get that insight and then figure out how to do both of those things at the same time, because we've had way too many examples of folks not wanting to go there with in case it doesn't work because they feel like by doing that they are, quote unquote, giving up or not kind of giving it their all. And so and to not have that drastic switch from all in on team survivor and team going to beat this to, okay, now we need to make a drastic shift to preparing my spouse, preparing my family, preparing my kids for if I'm not here someday.
Is there not initially enough honesty on the doctor-patient side where they don't feel like they have enough information to kind of begin to make those kind of discernments?
I don't know if it's a matter of honesty. I think by and large, oncologists are great with this kind of stuff. I don't think it's a matter of being dishonest. I think it's a matter of explicitly naming it and being upfront about it and talking about it through the lens of being a mom or a dad, because that's often what's missing, right? If you're a 35-year-old mom going through this versus a 68-year-old man going through this, it's not to say one is harder or easier or more or less challenging, but they're very different, right? If you have young children at home, we know this from our experience, we know this from the research, that shapes how you think about your cancer care, that shapes how you make decisions about your cancer care, and it is central. It is the leading indicator of what's important to you and how you go through this. And so naming that, and that's where part of our job is putting this on the table and saying, look, if you got a mom or a dad with cancer, talking about it and talking about them being a mom or a dad with cancer is necessary. Otherwise, we're missing the mark. And so that's kind of a broader sense of what we're trying to get at is is working with these parents through the lens of being parents, right? Not through the lens of someone who has cancer or someone who has anxiety or depression, but someone who's a mom or a dad. And there's a lot of important discussions to have with the children, with the spouses, with the neighbors, with someone who you may want to help your husband figure out when your daughter reaches a certain age, of how to have conversations, all these kind of things. We just heard this last night in our group at the Fathers. We have a man who has a child bumping up against puberty, and he is feeling at a loss and doesn't have really anyone there. So there's a lot of work to do on the front end when moms or dads have cancer, that if they survive their cancer and go on, then great, right? That's wonderful. Those conversations didn't do any harm. But in the case that doesn't work out, there's that window of time to help the surviving parent and the surviving children, really kind of put them on a path toward adaptation and healing.
Yeah. I remember I was on a trip recently to Houston, and there was this monument that was it was like a cancer survivorhood monument. And you could go around these different stations of the cross, sort of plaques, and sort of think about your journey as the survivor, as the cancer survivor. And one of the plaques absolutely floored me because it just said, "Decide that you will be the one that survives." And I thought, oh boy, like that's a painful one. It's just hilarious that it's in the context of choice and decision making. But it sounds like what you meet so many people who are looking for such a tender kind of discernment. They're just trying to figure out what stage of any process they're in to help figure out what's in their control. Does that sound right, Don?
It does, if someone asks the question or provides an opening for it. And one of the things that we've been struck by is that it very often doesn't even enter into the conversation. Kind of in other words, part of what we're trying to do is to change the culture in cancer care, so that oncologists, when they're talking with someone and they happen to know that they've got kids, to ask the questions: how is this going with your kids? Have you talked with your kids about it? Do you have any questions about how to explain things? And it makes perfect sense, but it's remarkable to us how much of a blind spot there is in medicine and even in psychosocial support. We don't always focus on this. So if there is the opportunity to talk about it, then yes, you're absolutely right. The discernment of, and how does this play out for you, becomes really relevant in both those ways that Justin talked about: decision-making medically and communication with your children.
Wow. And I know this is hard to give as a elevator pitch for what is your best advice for people who do want to figure out how to have that conversation? What are some of the maybe scripts, or just even emotional starting places that you use when you're trying to help people start to have that conversation?
Yeah, for parents talking with their children, you mean? Yeah. So it's a great question. I think the number one rule of thumb is to be honest, right? To be honest with your children. Now, to what degree you're honest and how much detail you give in that honesty depends on the situation, on your children's developmental level. But honesty, and that is the foundation. And that's something we talk a lot with parents about, that you have a relationship with your child, of course, before this, but this is different, and you're building trust around this issue.
Yeah.
Right. And if your children feel like you're giving them the information they need, you're volunteering this information, you're not hiding a lot of things, then that helps turn down the temperature and helps reduce some of the anxiety, right? It's already going to be a challenging enough situation. If children feel like they're being updated and told what's going on, and don't have to kind of put their ear to the door to see what's really going on behind the scenes conversations, and don't have to kind of look up their own stuff on the internet to get the real information. If that can come from the parents, they can control the narrative, they can control how this is introduced, and that all begins with honest, open, age appropriate conversation. And I don't know if to some folks that might sound kind of obvious, but it's really hard, right? I think one of our first top instincts as parents is to protect our children,
Yeah.
right? And it can feel like telling them something that's going to make them upset or distressed. We might want to protect them by not telling that or really couching it. That rarely works out well,
Yeah.
right? And we've had a lot of parents say that over time, that they've been honest with their children up front. It was really hard, difficult conversations. But then down the road, when they got, say, good scan news or good results, they could go back to their children, tell them that news, and their children believed them about the good stuff because they were honest at the beginning about the hard stuff. So being upfront and honest is not only good in the ways that it might seem, but it can really pay off in the future for families.
Oh man, I would have loved something like that. I really didn't know exactly what to say at all to my son, especially because it just went on for such a long time, and it felt like the answers would have to keep changing, as he got older. But my best idea, which I'm still not mad about, is I got one of those like anatomical things, but for the abdomen, because like I didn't even know where my where my colon was exactly when I got cancer, and it just has all the parts that kind of come out. And I was like, so it's just like a little 3D puzzle, and I was like, hey, this is the part of me that there was a mistake in, and they had to take this part out. And so every time, because I was so worried, every time someone would come up and say, are you okay? And I was always, there's always a different stage of okayness I was at. So I was so worried that he would hear people's distress or hear people say cancer, and then that cancer, the word would just get so scary so I was just like, Zach, we always have to replace all of our cells all the time. This is how we fix a cut on our skin. This is how so the body has to fix things, but sometimes when it fixes things, it makes mistakes. So when people say cancer, they just mean that the body made a mistake. And here's where my mistakes are.
I love that, because you found language that was your own language. It was authentic. It was an explanation because it came from you that your son was going to understand and make sense. But I just wanted to go back for a second to something you mentioned a little while ago, which was this notion of, are there any scripts? Yeah. And in fact, we just completed a study testing scripts to help parents talk with their kids about cancer, depending on what kind of cancer it is, what stage it is, how old their kid is that they're most concerned about, what kind of style it is, so that this is an online resource that we're about to launch in the next couple of months, where you put in all that information, and then if your kid says, are you going to die? And no one knows how to answer that. There is some suggested scripted language that's developmentally appropriate and tailored to your prognosis and cancer. And if you like that language, you could use that language. And if you're inspired by that, or you hate it and you say, no, I don't want to say it that way, I want to say it a different way, then at least we'll kind of give you something to start with. And so most people aren't lucky enough to be able to make an appointment with Justin Yopp to have this conversation. So we're hoping that this will be an online resource for parents anywhere that they could go on and then get some tips about how to have these conversations.
You beautiful geniuses. We will put all of that information and all updates that you give us in the show notes, so that anybody listening to this can go there and find exactly what you're doing right now, this very second.
Cool.
That's so lovely, guys, because we get scared, and when we get scared, we lose language so quickly. And then we hope just somebody else will fill in the blank. But then I think we're always scared as parents that maybe like the wrong person will fill in the blanks if we don't do it right.
Yeah. And one of our widowed dads dropped just this amazing wisdom bomb last night in our group. It was so wonderful, because the guys were talking about not knowing what was coming next for them, just as most people with cancer may not know what's coming next for them. The way you described it, it keeps changing. And he said this beautiful thing. He said that while you're waiting for the new narrative to come together, you have to tolerate the fact that there's no narrative sometimes. I just love that.
Oh, that's good.
Right.
That's so good.
Yeah, because he had a narrative how his life was playing out. and that narrative got completely disrupted, and a new one is not taking hold, and he's having to tolerate where he's at right now, where his daughter's at right now.
There was something else you said in our last conversation that really stuck with me. That feeling that the dad has about not knowing. You gave such a lovely framework for how we have to grieve our imagined futures as we practice figuring out what hope feels like. I thought that was such a perfect encapsulation of one of the dreams of the Everything Happens project, is to learn to speak more honestly about what we've lost and then try to figure out what then is still possible, like in the face of that knowing.
Yeah, you can grieve over things that you had and lost, and you can grieve over things that you were hoping to have and will never have. And in fact, we had a version of that last night. Essentially, it was a very rich group last night as I think about it, but one of the guys essentially said, I'm broken in ways that I can't get fixed. And that's just simply true. That doesn't mean that his life isn't worth living. It doesn't mean it's not full of meaning and that he can't have fun and all sorts of things. But if you get cancer, if you lose a partner to cancer, if you lose your parent to cancer, there is a part of you that is busted, that probably isn't fixable entirely, right? There are other responses to it, but that's just real.
I don't know how to start the sentence. I have a favorite poet mortician, but I have a favorite poet mortician.
Of course you do.
He was describing that feeling of like when his dad passed, and the second he comes, he pulls in there's this one moment every day where he reaches for his phone to call him. And in the space of that there's always this little echo. And then he goes on to describe how sometimes we become the people that we miss. And then you grow into new roles that you wouldn't have had. But I can't tell you how refreshing I find it when you're like, no, there's some things that break. And when people hear that, I think it doesn't hurt nearly as much as our culture thinks it will. I think that's very satisfying to know the truth.
Yeah.
You guys, thank you for your endlessly brilliant minds, but just as your friend and as your admirer, for your very soft hearts. It always fills me up to get to see you. And I'm so grateful.
The feelings are mutual. We're big fans. We love what you're doing. And thanks for having us on. It's been great.